Welcome to the Meat and Potatoes podcast. We're here with Carlos Kemeny, who is the co-founder and CEO of DrumData. How are you?
Great. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining. You've got an impressive background in both education and career experience. Let's talk a little bit about that because it does lead into like why we're talking and what entrepreneurial pursuits you're after. Start with like, I guess, college, because you've got a lot of that.
Unfortunately, no, it was. It's funny, my dad always taught us that education was important. My mom, and so I did an engineering degree at Purdue, did an MBA there, and thought, it was during the 2007-2008 crisis, and thought, Carnegie Mellon. I'd met some folks along the way through entrepreneurial opportunities, and thought very highly of Carnegie Mellon, and I applied to a dual PhD program there, got in. And so that mapped out a path towards academe. I studied basically a dual degree in economics and in engineering and public policy, and really studied decisions and uncertainty. So my dissertation was studying the behavior of venture capitalists and private equity and how they invest in different geographies based on things like non-competes and experiences and political orientations. So it's all very interesting. And I really loved being able to ponder deeply about these problems, and observing people's behavior is always fun.
Yeah.
But that was a great experience with blending data and decisions. And that seemingly led me to this idea, maybe I'll be a great university administrator. So I went to the University of Texas system. Admiral Bill McRaven had just become the chancellor, so he had been the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Yeah.
Was leading the University of Texas system. What an opportunity.
Yeah.
I mean, it's one of the biggest systems. And so I led entrepreneurship and innovation at the University of Texas across, MD Anderson and UT Austin and El Paso. And I learned that I really didn't enjoy being an administrator.
Mm-hmm.
It was very different than what I expected. And I wanted to be out in the field, and I'd learned at that point that I loved data. And so that's when I came to Utah. Family was here. They'd moved from Indiana. I grew up in Brazil, or I was born in Brazil, grew up in Indiana, and really appreciated entrepreneurship throughout all of those formative years. But I think this was an opportunity based on family. It was also an opportunity based on being able to apply the things that I'd learned instead of keeping it in an ivory tower. And I loved it. I loved working. I came to Domo pre-IPO and got to do some great things there, and then Weave. And so,
yeah.
I feel like a lot of the stars aligned to come here, and I've enjoyed being in Utah ever since.
Very cool. So with your brain and your background, you obviously love it, or you wouldn't have kept going to school and then working in the field. And there's data wonks who that's kind of all they can ever talk about, and they love it, and they're really good at it, right? To the point where it's like, will you make a decision on your own or with limited data? And it's a whole different ball game, for folks like me that aren't data centric and don't know how to do it. But with what you're building at Drum, what is the tie-in there? Because this is your entrepreneurial journey now, and you kind of get to dictate how the whole thing works and how it comes together. So give us the founding story of Drum, and ultimately, like, what does the company do?
Yeah, I should back up too, because my grandfather was a Hungarian Jew, and my father, had always, endorsed to us this idea of being an entrepreneur, but you migrate from place to place, and I feel like that's pretty entrepreneurial in itself.
Yeah.
But I was probably the first person in the family that had the opportunity to do this, so I feel like I'm standing on the shoulders of those giants.
Yeah.
All these people, and it's neat to see how a community kind of helps you do that.
Yeah.
And I felt like that was true from Domo and experiencing that IPO, going to Weave. So I led data at Weave, and what a great founding team. I mean, Brandon and Clint and Jared.
Mm-hmm.
And I look at them as being the facilitators of being able to do something that I'd always want to do. And this is multi-generational.
Yeah.
an entrepreneur, like that's a big deal.
Yeah.
And so being able to do that, I really credit them for that opportunity and being founder, employee friendly. What a neat system that they ran, and
Yeah.
I really appreciate them. So that story leads into the ability then with Weave's IPO to then start my own thing, raise capital from Coldwater Capital in May 2021. What a great time to raise, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it was, this idea for Drum was based on my experiences at Weave, where Jefferson Lyman, who was the chief product officer at the time, and Clint, CTO, had said, hey, we have this big struggle between the product team at Weave and the support team. And this data isn't getting into their hands in a way where they're using it to improve the customer experience, solve that problem. And so I took 6 months to figure out getting all the stakeholders aligned, all of the experiences that people have in being able to arrange things operationally was the same story.
Mm-hmm.
And we saved the company 30% of the tickets, lots of money by just doing two things: just cleaning up data and giving it over to the product team in a way that they could use it. And so that's what led to DrumCV, the product being founded, was trying to figure out how do we make data clean, utilize AI to make it easier, and get it into the hands of people that could actually use it instead of just have data,
Yeah.
which doesn't really do much.
It's fairly worthless if it's just sitting there on a server or a spreadsheet. So with this will be a tough question to answer theoretically, but maybe we just do a fake example. You're trying to sell a product. Let's say it's a camping product, and you've got data, which could consist of thousands of things, right? And your end goal is to sell the product and not become a data scientist. But you could sell it a lot better if you had like the clean data, to your point. So is that where Drum would intersect?
That's right. I think that a lot of people today they get paralyzed with data, and they invest, but they don't know why they're investing,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't know how to gauge the success of what they're doing with it. And you're seeing that a lot now. I've recently done a study with tech companies here in Silicon Slopes, and on a scale of 0 to 10, what would you guess is the score of the extent to which people trust their data without AI to action upon? So, you have somebody that looks at their dashboards. What's the number? 0 to 10, 0 being they don't trust it at all, 10 being lots of trust. What do you think? Where do you think that lands?
3.
It's 2.4.
Okay.
That's not a good investment. That's not a good way to do that. And part of the reason why is because data, and this is important for the AI discussion, and we're seeing this, is that you really only have two things that you could really do with data anyway. It's to automate things, and it's to make decisions off of.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't have trust, you can't do any of those. You can't do either of those things. And so that's where a lot of people are actually introducing a lot of noise with their data when they bring it all into the warehouse, or they just build a bunch of dashboards. What we've found is this creates lots of noise. And the reason why people invest in data or even have analysts is to reduce uncertainty. And this is where the PhD comes back in.
Yeah.
People wait. They don't do anything when there's uncertainty. And if I write a book here in the next 5 years, I'm going to call it Managing the Delta.
Mm-hmm.
It's managing the uncertainty. That's what you care about, not trying to get a bunch of information to make uncertainty 0. I think Colin Powell said that that's when you're way too late. Then everybody has that information.
Yeah.
So there's a range of confidence in your data where it makes sense to make decisions off of. It might be too early if it's less than that. It's way too late if it's more. And so a lot of people are actually investing really poorly in that because they're not looking at it in that way.
Yeah.
And they say, hey, let's figure out how to use data for something that we could sell in this big way. And what they really should be doing is dissecting it down to what can we automate for the consumer, or what can we help them with decisions that are trustworthy. And this is actually going to be more important in the AI world because of the lack of observability.
Yeah.
The less we can look into these models, the more trust is going to be important, and the processes that we rely on to make it trustworthy is really critical.
Yeah. Again, maybe a tough question. So of all the organizations in the world, 2-part question: who does really, really well with data and making decisions based on data? and who has the hardest time based on the data that they get, whether it's like the IRS, CIA, FedEx. I'm just thinking of all these nightmare scenarios. So first question is, who has the hardest job based on the amount of data they get, and what company or organization does the best with the data that they do have?
So obviously, the more complex the decision or the process, then certainly there's great opportunity, but there's a lot of struggle because people don't know how to govern over that data. And so I don't feel like there's a specific domain. This is cross domains. But I also feel like what we've seen is that the use case and buttoning down that use case is really important. So what are you trying to achieve? What's the decision you're trying to affect? What's the task you're trying to automate? If you can't dissect that down to the simple, and you use the camping example,
Mm-hmm.
that may be as simple as saying we need to figure out our product mix better, or where is our best distribution channel. If you don't dissect the decision down, what are you expecting it to do?
Yeah.
What are you expecting AI to do for your data? And what ends up happening is you have lots of people that are using their intuition, which is not a bad thing, by the way. And I think that oftentimes we hear the phrase data driven,
Mm-hmm.
and you yourself just said, hey, I may not be, the data, but actually humans use data all the time to
Yeah.
process images, and we're talking. That's a lot of information in real time.
Yep.
We are data driven. So I don't like that phrase. I don't like
Yeah.
the idea that we're not data driven. Humans are data driven. It's an oxymoron.
Yeah.
And so because of that, I think we need to give ourselves credit and simplify. That's really the way that we solve business problems anyway, is by simplifying what's the objective, how are we going to do that, and not introduce more noise. And I think data has become more about FOMO with regards to getting all of this data, but that's contributing to more noise and
Yeah.
exponentially increasing it every time you add a new data source. And so I don't think that the answer is domain or industry specific. I think it's the people that do the best with data, or the people that are going to struggle the most with data, is dependent on how well they organize their objective and simplify the process for using data that matters to reduce noise, to make decisions, or to automate.
Okay. Well, a good example, well, who knows, but going to Disneyland. I don't download the app because I don't want to share my data, but my wife does. But I'm just looking at this amusement park, and like we're going to the front of the line here and back of the line there, ordering food here, and I can imagine the people on the other end watching like probably real time data. But that all started with probably an objective of we want people to buy more turkey legs, or we want them to have a better experience, or we want them to buy a ticket to come back in October. Probably thousands of objectives there. But if like the main objective was to come back within a year, that would be maybe from the CEO or the VP. And then that boils down to all the way to like the boots on the ground, right? Which would be a pretty tall order of like making these decisions based on data. So who sits in the middle and kind of jockeys and is the air traffic controller on that?
Well, I think that we look at the individual, and this may kind of broaden this discussion a little bit too, but you have the way that we make decisions is that we start out and we learn maybe how to pick up a fork and
Mm-hmm.
start eating, and we learn how to make sentences and talk.
Yeah.
We maybe start learning to drive.
Yep.
At some point. That's complex decision making, by the way. There's a lot that goes into the decisions for a teenage driver, which make every parent very scared.
Yeah.
But at the same time, that type of skill that's built is a foundation. And as you make smaller decisions, it enables you to make bigger decisions. And I think organizations function similarly. Oftentimes when we look at increasing revenue, that's a pretty lofty order. And that's what we would designate as a Y variable in an equation. It's on the left side. And that's not something that you can really control by just wishing it.
Right.
As every entrepreneur, any founder knows, you
Yeah.
have to do something. And so the X variables on the other side of the equation, independent variables, they're the variables that you do something about to influence that Y. And Jacob Miller over at Pattern. He's a good friend. He's actually a cousin-in-law, and he's the head of data science there. He brought up a point here on a napkin, and he said, hey, if I put to a stakeholder a diagram and I say, hey, if we do this data project and your decision is going to be X right now, that your hypothesis, if we do this project and the data actually suggests X1 or B or C, would you actually do it?
Mm-hmm.
Or are you locked down into that? This is the constant conversation on the consulting firms, right? Are they there to validate what you want to do, or are they actually trying to? And I think in this example of Disney that you're using, when you're looking at the Y variable, there's going to be things that you believe are going to influence that Y. And you can spend a lifetime hypothesizing, and that will make you paralyzed on being able to do anything. But every entrepreneur knows you just experiment. And so you start doing X, you do X2, X3, X4, and if it doesn't work, then you drop it, right? And you evaluate, was it me or was it the environment or what?
Yeah.
And that is how you do exactly what you're talking about. So I don't think it's something about who's playing the role in the middle. It's not more, and certainly organizations matter and how these things get formulated in terms of what actions actually matter.
Yeah.
But I think that we don't also give ourselves enough credit for the intuition that we have.
Yeah.
Intuition is a great way for a researcher or for a practitioner, an entrepreneur to operate. So I believe this, I'm going to do this, and if it doesn't work, I do something else.
Yeah.
And so the faster that happens, the more likelihood that you're going to succeed in driving why.
Yeah.
Or, these big lofty goals for a Disney, for example. Yeah.
Because to your point, like humans are compounding vast amounts of data every day of their lives. And another example maybe I'd bring up is like June 6, 1944, D-Day, right? Tons of data there, but it ultimately boiled down to like 2 or 3 brains and ultimately one brain that had years of data, but ultimately had to make that decision because the objective was to like win the war. Today with like an AI, like a good AI machine, if you plugged in all of the variables of the Normandy invasion, what do you think the answer would be of go or wait? And you might not know that much about that particular day in history, so it might be an unfair question, but what's your answer there?
I think that we would expect way too much from AI to give us the answer, if that was what we're asking it. And I think that this is where it ends up being really important to look at the research we're doing. We're doing a research project now that measures the extent to which you trust in your sleep AI to make decisions for you.
Right.
So research.drumdata.ai. And if you look at the data, most people don't trust AI to make decisions for them. And so the bigger the consequence, and that's one of the axes that we have. One is to what extent you trust AI versus human. And the other one is inconsequential versus consequential. D-Day, to me, seems pretty consequential.
Right.
Anything that's in the consequential quadrant is pretty low trust in AI.
Yeah.
And part of this, I think, is human behavior. We want to preserve our agency because that's what we have. Again, I have ancestors that died in the Holocaust. They had agency to think.
Yep.
They had, right? And we hear about these stories, I read in the journals, and that's really important to me.
Yeah.
That they had some kind of freedom, even if they were bound. Right. And that is something that drives us, that drives humanity. I think that that's something we should be concerned about. If we look at decision making about outsourcing all of our decisions for very big consequential, and again, the research shows that the more consequential, the less likely we are to trust it. But even in smaller things like vacation destinations, if you were sleeping, would you allow it to pick Greece versus Italy versus Spain versus Brazil? It's not it's not AI. Okay, do it. It's I want some input, and I think this is reflective of our belief that without our decisions, we don't really do much. Yeah, that's human progress, is our ability to make decisions. So I think that, to answer directly your question, I think that AI would have never been suitable to answer that question.
Gotcha.
But I also feel like we would have never posed that question to AI.
Yeah. But you might imagine like Dwight Eisenhower, because the buck stopped with him, like, man, I wish there was one more person I could ask or validate. Um, who knows? But my guess is anyone that has to make that monumental decision wishes there was somebody else that could co-make it with them.
I think it's an astute point, because when you look at data and the role of AI at this point in time, we know based on what's happening with the degradation of ChatGPT now that inputs matter,
Yeah.
and observability actually really matters to us. When it just came out, everybody was fascinated. It was a fun tool to use, and it's fascinating. It's amazing.
Yeah.
It's incredible. But the more that it sits there and we use it, the more we want to understand it. And it's not something that's well understood,
Mm-hmm.
even by the folks at OpenAI. So that's why they're collecting all of these things. The outputs are not predictable all the time.
Yeah.
And so because of this, I really feel like where our focus in DrumCV was always around how do we create observability and create good process for humans to participate if they want to.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we've done with the product and support use case. But we're thinking more broadly now about just observability in general. How do you look into an AI model?
Yeah.
How do you craft it in a way where it segments things that you want to segment? How do you do that in a user-friendly way? We're digging into these deep questions. And if you ask anybody about, do you want your legal contracts to be available to your salespeople? The answer is, of course, no.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want your deep financials in a public company to be available in a model to anybody?
Yeah.
Due to the liabilities from the SEC, right? Like, so the answer is no.
Yeah.
And so now we need to create much better observability into these vector databases. We need to do so much more to understand models instead of just deploy them out.
Yeah.
And you're starting to see that happen. There's a lot of companies that are starting to see this and, think about infrastructure a little bit differently for AI models instead of just, can you do it? But I think that data has always been that way. And that's what's interesting to me in looking at just the analytics without the AI. If we look at it in terms of uncertainty, data is there, and it's only useful if it reduces that uncertainty. And when we add so much data in, it creates more uncertainty. So the simple framework of this problem is it reducing uncertainty or is it increasing? And as a decision maker, your decisions are predicated upon uncertainty being reduced.
Yeah.
To be able to then make a conscientious, good decision.
Yeah.
The more inconsequential, you're okay automating that.
Mm-hmm.
You still want trust, for that process or whatever. But the more consequential it is, the research clearly shows that you wouldn't let AI make that decision, and the uncertainty has to be drastically reduced for you to allow AI to really have a predominant role in making that decision for you.
Yeah. I did take that assessment, and I was surprised that I'm quite trusting of AI. And then I was thinking, that's weird, because I'm not overly technical, and I don't use technology for much in my life. But I say yes to almost everything and anything, even if it's hold my beer, right? You want to do this? Yes. And I know I'm doing it for the story, a lot of it. That's just my life. So I was pretty high up on that, including if this car wants to drive me around, I don't really care if I get in a bad crash. I obviously don't want to impact anyone else, but it was a lot higher than I thought. This is interesting because probably right now there's big quant hedge funds and private equity groups that are making bets on this is going to be a bad 6 months or a good 6 months. And you hear about it later, they lost their shorts. And these are pretty smart folks with pretty good data sets. So I guess you talked about that, there's still that freedom of being a human being where you're going to make that decision. And so they either went against the data and you're no, or the data showed them something that was wrong. But do you find any comedic relief in when the best of the best are catastrophically off?
I think that it's a macroeconomic view that I take. On average, people are just going to do poorly. And we see that in these cycles.
Yeah.
You have a lot of firms that go under. You have a lot of venture capitalists that underperform. There's going to be somebody that wins, though. It's just a statistical anomaly that's predictable. That in many ways, that is predictable, that there will be one or two. And they end up writing the book. They create the big, right? And they end up being the most brilliant person. And even more unpredictable, it seems like, but at the same time, when you have that type of comfort, you make different decisions at that point.
Yeah.
So when you have X billions of dollars, and now that's propagated, you're going to make different decisions that are riskier too.
Yeah.
And so it's just interesting, like the ping pong balls or the pool balls in that effect.
Yeah.
The equation updates. And I look at this more from a macroeconomic view, which is, in highly uncertain environments, you're going to have the majority that are going to perform poorly.
Yeah.
But there's always going to be one. And so it's less about which one is it, and it's more about that somebody will.
Yeah.
And so that's the most predictable out of that equation.
Yeah. Yeah, it's always funny, and I'm just making up an example. Like, people are buying the dollar menu at McDonald's instead of the super meal, and that means that real estate prices are going down in 12 months, right? And you're like, I don't know about any of that because it's some crazy data set, but the person also might like just be kind of crazy as well.
Correlation is not causation.
Yeah.
I think that's fair. I think that we lean way too much on insights when they don't have real value.
Yeah.
And I've learned that only since becoming a founder, by the way.
Gotcha.
I felt like, the insight is so valuable. When I was just wearing the data hat, I thought, look at me. Like, I just saved the company hundreds of thousands of dollars because of the insight that I made. And what a ridiculous statement. Like, how do data science people or data people like actually believe that statement? They don't.
Yeah.
And the reason why is because as a founder, the decision is actually just a starting point, and then everything you do after the fact, the actions that you take, the subsequent decisions, the speed, that's what matters. That's how you create value.
Yeah.
And so the decision is actually just, you got to do something, right? You have to start somewhere and do it.
Yeah.
And in fact, for that reason, I actually think the people that win in this space the most are people that set up systems for feedback that can then measure the value of the decisions that they've made and figure out when they want to stop versus when they want to keep on going with this decision. That's infinitely more valuable than the actual decision itself. Now, I almost look at this like this bullseye. If you kind of drop out of a plane and you have a parachute, it's just so much easier if you're closer to the bullseye.
Mm-hmm.
So you use better data to get you closer to there. If you have a 300-pound backpack, you're 3 miles away versus if you're 300 feet away.
Yeah.
And so you have a much more likely chance to get to the bullseye if you do that. But it starts with a decision to jump out with that parachute.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't, you're not doing anything. And that's true for AI right now. Like, there's a lot of companies I see that are paralyzed, a lot of CTOs that are paralyzed. Yeah. Boards are pressuring people to say, what's your strategy with AI? You have lots of people that want to use AI in the company, and they're doing shotgun, like, we want to use AI for something.
Yeah.
And at the same time, they're not using it for specific use cases. They don't know exactly what they're trying to get out of it. And so they're using a bunch of data, and that's not what they should be doing. What they should be doing, and this is something we preach every single day at Drum, but we really want people to figure out what is valuable to you right now and to your users, and figure out whether or not you have the data to do that. Is it available? And do you have the ability to deliver good quality and trust to the threshold that they require for a good experience?
Yeah.
That is a good starting point. And actually, that's a lot cheaper than most people think. Getting a baseline set up to do that can be pretty cheap, and you can start getting some data now to see if it's good enough, and then figure out how you want to invest after that.
Yeah. People may disagree, but like, good enough is oftentimes good enough.
It's a hard lesson to learn. I feel like that's one of the failures that I've had. Like, you want to over-engineer things. There's just this idea of this convergence of perfectness, like if I'm going to put something out, and clearly there's so many people that have talked about this, just get it out, ship it, just get it out. And there's so much truth to that. Just send out a horrible product. It's the best way to get feedback and understand the market. But yeah, I think I fall into that trap too.
Well, the cool thing is, like, you've got all this experience, and you have to apply it with your own company now. And so you live in this world where you're advising and telling folks, like, this is the best way to use AI and data. And then you've got to apply those principles internally as well.
It's hard. Oh man, there's so much sleep I've lost over this. Like, decision making is hard. And I have so much more empathy now for people like Brandon and Clint. I love those guys, but I feel like, it's interesting how I think earlier in my career I was pretty critical of management always, the strategy's wrong. We're not doing it right. The company, and you're kind of looking at it. And you're like, I deal with the customer. And I felt this way at Domo. Like, hey, why don't they see these? Why don't they listen?
Yeah.
And at the same time, there's so much more empathy for the complexity of decision making.
Yeah.
There's just so much complexity, and so I really believe this luck. People say luck all the time is like a big part of it. And I think that that's really true. I know I'm not smart enough to deal with this every day.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of humility that comes your way in founding a company.
Yeah.
Which is good, and it's also hard.
Yeah.
It can be crippling at times, but I feel like one of the things that I feel like it's taught me most, though, is to respect that decision making is hard, and at the same time that you can get better at it.
Yeah.
And I think if a lot of people treated that just as they would lifting weights,
yeah,
decision making, and observed and actually reflected on their process for making a decision instead of the outcome of the decision, they get better at making decisions. And I feel like that's happened with me as well.
That's good. Yeah, I'd be interested with former presidents of the United States, like their first month out of office, where it was just the buck stopped with them, and it was decision, dozens a day. And then their wife tells them, go empty the trash. And then after that, clean the kitchen. And then after that, organize the garage. My guess is they're like relieved to not have to make decisions, and they just get to follow orders for a little while.
I think that there's so much simplicity in that. There's so much value in what you're saying, because I think oftentimes when you get into these highly complex, there have been days that I'm just thinking, wouldn't it be nice if it's just a linear path?
Yeah.
Just, okay, do this. Now your sales are going to go up.
Yep.
And it feels like the complexity just gets more exponentially difficult with every single marketing campaign that goes out. And in this macro environment, it's been really challenging to figure out how do you sell to B2B with a certain timeline before a fundraiser. It's like,
yeah.
But I think that what I've seen actually with DrumTV, with the product and support teams, it actually just takes good leadership too. Like, it takes somebody that has confidence and has some experience to say, this is where we think the bullseye is, to act on that. I've seen that a lot actually with product teams and their inability to really measure product team performance. That's been one of the challenges we faced. So we built a product to, again, improve intelligence to product teams to act in areas that make sense to reduce customer pain.
Yeah.
And we've learned a couple important challenging lessons in that, which is, number one, product teams don't like to be held accountable.
Mm-hmm.
They never are. The only times that product teams actually get measured is, did they deliver and do people like them?
Yeah.
That's really all it is. They don't really get measured on, these other metrics oftentimes, even though they're supposed to be the CEO of their own product. They're not really gauged on, did they generate revenue? That's a sales team's fault, right?
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, to improve the customer experience, they really aren't held accountable. And part of that is because the data is not available to do it.
Yeah.
And so we've kind of had to understand that environment quite a bit. And it would be so much nicer to have simplicity to say, but that's mitigated by leadership that says, this is important to us. There's no here or there. Good experience to the customer means that they don't have to call in 20 times a year.
Sure.
And if you have leaders that do that just say, good customer experience means 3 times a year, you can do it.
Yeah.
I've seen that happen.
Absolutely. Well, I think this was a good decision to have you on the podcast.
You know what? We'll see what the polls say on that one.
I'm sure it'll be great. Thank you so much, Carlos. Really appreciate the insights. Appreciate your time and coming, and best of luck to you and the team.
Thank you so much. It's great to be on the show.